Hey, it's Sean from Crafted Elements here again. One of the questions I get asked most frequently is about what type of resin to use and what tools you're going to need to make resin art and resin epoxy resin charcuterie boards. So really what we're asking is, what type of resin do I need to make this, or what type of resin do I need to make this? So there's some core differences here. This is a poured cast. So you can see there's resin all between this wood, and this is typically what a epoxy resin charcuterie board would look like. But then there's also the kind of the art resin, which is basically when the resin goes over the wood. So here is an example of that, where they've got the a beach sort of beach colors, and then the epoxy resin waves. But it's still a very, very thin layer of resin, and that's the key. When you have a high volume of resin setting, you generate a lot of heat. Resin is an A-B mixture, and what happens is an exothermic reaction. So you don't need to know what that is, but essentially when you're mixing these, it gets hot. When you use a tabletop thin pour resin to try and cast something, it gets so hot that it ends up bubbling up and becoming like some sort of a Frankenstein mess, and it's garbage. You've wasted the board, you wasted the resin, you wasted your time, you wasted a lot. So that's the key here. When you're searching for resin, and you want to do epoxy art like this, where you're epoxying an entire countertop to create a thin layer, or maybe you wanted to do some ocean art or some epoxy resin art over wood, then you're going to use something like this. I think this is sold on Amazon. This is New Classic Resin. There's also a brand called Art Resin. Crystal Resin, I believe, has a version of this as well, but it's thin pour. I think it's up to 1/4 of an inch. So you do not want to use this for actually casting or making something like this. If you're making something like this, there's a lot of options. The bigger ones that I can think of are like Eco Epoxy, which is kind of I don't know if it's VOC free, but it's more of an environmentally friendly resin. There are Crystal Resin does make a casting resin. There's this resin that we use here because we're in Canada. This is by Rusty Design. It's imported from China, but essentially most resin is a BPA, essentially bisphenol acetate resin. And this is a slow cure epoxy resin for casting. You can see right on it, it says casting. That's your key. You want to have something that's going to allow you to do 1 inch or 2 inches of cast. If you're doing something thin like this, an epoxy resin that dries typically in 24 hours, or a 1 inch thick max resin is fine. If you're doing something thick like this guy, you want to have, this is 2 inch thick maple. You're going to end up with 2 inches of resin, and that's a lot of volume. So you're going to want to have a slow cast or slow curing epoxy. And essentially what that means is it's going to get less hot, but it's going to set for a longer period of time. And that means you're not going to have the bubbling up and air bubbles and craziness that goes on when you use the wrong type of resin for the wrong type of project. So I hope that made sense. To be clear, covering wood, art, thin, you use a tabletop or an art resin. If you're doing casting, that's up to 1 inch thick. You can use a 24-hour cure casting resin. If you're doing casting or like a river table or a big thick charcuterie board with something that's 1.5 inches or 2 inches thick, you're going to want to use something like this, which is a slow cast or slow cure resin. Now that we've addressed that, the question becomes, if you're building at least charcuterie boards or small resin art, what type of mold do you use? So there are 3 types of molds really available. One is something you can easily make, and that's the wood and tuck tape mold. I made this in a previous video. If you go back on the YouTube channel, you can see how we made it. It's simple. It's really just cutting plywood. Some people prefer to use melamine covered chipboard because it's cheap and it's very smooth. I just use regular smooth face plywood, like this is aspen or maple or something. You cover that with tuck tape, with a sheathing tape you can get at any hardware store. And the reason you do that is to prevent the epoxy resin from sticking to the wood. If you build a mold out of wood and you pour the resin in it, you're not getting that mold off. It's now part of your board. So you end up with the wood frame, cover the entire thing in tuck tape, assemble it, and then you'll seal it with either an acrylic caulking or a pure silicone. And again, in the case of the silicone, your resin will not stick to that. So that's what we do that for. And you're going to want to seal all the edges. So I did make this in another video if you want to check that out. But this is honestly I don't want to use the word poor man's, but I mean, really, it's a cheap version of doing it. And it's the best if you are making a few casts. So if you're doing 3 or 4 a year, or you're just making, one for the wife or something like that, then totally do this method. It's super cheap, plywood's cheap, duct tape's cheap. This maybe took 15 or 20 minutes to build. The disadvantage is that once you do your pour, you're gonna have to take this apart. By prying it apart or unscrewing the screws, depending on how you've assembled it, and it may or may not be usable again. So that's kind of the one method. The other methods are to use either an HDPE form or a silicone form. So you can see my table here is actually solid HDPE. I designed this workbench because nothing really sticks to it. Paint sticks on it, resin sticks on it. You just chip it right off and that's it. You can't really do that with wood. So an HDPE form is very much like this. It's still individual pieces of material, whether it be wood or HDPE, and you screw it together and seal it. Here's another example, a bigger example. There you go. Okay, pretty heavy. You can buy these pre-made. There are companies that make them, and some of them have built-in mechanisms which will allow you to have little clamps to hold down your wood, which is kind of handy. But the disadvantage is A, they can still leak. B, they need assembled and disassembled when you are done your pour, which takes time. So that's actually why our company developed these. And these are pure silicone, super thick, super durable molds for big resin casting. So if you're making charcuterie boards or resin art, these things are the ticket. As you can see, they're super flexible. They never need to be resealed, and the entire production process is just much faster. You get one of these molds, this is an 18 by 9. There's also this big one, 24 by 12. They're both 1.5 inches deep, so they're sufficiently deep to make, in this case, maybe a small table or a thick board. You can use 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch, up to 1.5 inch thick wood to use in these molds. So really, you set your wood, you pour your resin, you let it dry or let it set, and you pop it out. That's it. There's nothing to unscrew. There's nothing to, have to fiddle with. And there's no way it's going to leak. The disadvantage to these, and I mean, we build these molds, we sell these molds at boardmolds.com. So if you go to boardmolds.com, it'll redirect you to our page where you can buy one of these. The disadvantage is they're expensive. Silicone is very expensive. It's basically on par with the cost of epoxy resin. This is very thick. You're talking about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch wall and bottom. So there's quite a bit of silicone used in these. The main thing is that it needs, if you're building like a charcuterie board like this, where you've got 2 pieces of live edge wood, you need to be able to hold them down. So what we do is we'll end up putting the wood in. Obviously this is not wood fit to it. And something like this, like just a weight. You can also use a spare piece of HDPE and then a weight on top of that, depending on how you want to do it. So that's, I think, the main disadvantage of the silicone board molds. But to me, they have significantly more advantages than the wood tuck tape or the HDPE molds. So again, if you want to buy one of these molds, you can go to boardmolds.com. And you can also, if you want to buy an HDPE mold, you can definitely do a Google search and find a few different companies that make those as well. So what else do you need to make one of these boards? Well, you're going to need wood. Live edge wood is typically what you would use. You need to be able to remove the bark. And for that, where is my bark removal knife? Not sure where that knife went, but essentially there's a removal knife. Oh, there it is. There's this guy. This is actually from Beavercraft. It's something I bought on Amazon, but it's pretty simple. You hold it like this. I can't show you on video because of the angle, but essentially you hold the blade like this and you go and you just remove the bark that way. And then if there's any little pieces of bark left over, you can take an 80 grit sandpaper on an orbital sander like that and remove the rest of it. So once you've got your wood, you're going to want to need to cut it. So essentially, I'm just going to give you a quick tour here. You're going to need a miter or chop saw. You're going to need a table saw. And you're also going to probably want to have a planer. The planer is effectively for making the resin and wood surface level once you're done. Because once you put the live edge boards in there and you pour your resin in, you're either gonna have too much resin or too little resin, and it's not gonna be the same. So the planer is effectively gonna level a playing field. Literally what it does is it planes it down to keep a consistent level edge. And I'm gonna basically walk through that entire process in another video on this YouTube channel. So if you check the other video on the full build, pour, plane and everything, you can see the entire thing. But essentially that's what you need. You've got your saws, you've got your molds, you've got your resin, you're gonna obviously need some sandpaper and then something to finish it with. We use walrus oil, which is a really cool product, and again, it's available from Amazon, or you can do a quick search from walrus oil. There you go. This stuff's awesome. This is cutting board oil, and we basically just liberally apply it to your finished piece, which you can see in the other video, and you know, let it sit there for 20 minutes to absorb the oil, wipe it off, let it sit for a day, and then it's mint. I mean, it's ready to, it's food grade and it's ready to use. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video on the different resins, the different molds, and what you're gonna need to actually build your charcuterie board. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you later.